Hi, my name's Austin. This is a presentation I originally gave at the Basic Income Earth Network conference in Brisbane last year. It's called Global Social Liberalism, a progressive ideology for the 21st century. So, what is global social liberalism? We can start by removing global and focusing just on what is social liberalism. And one thing it's not is social democracy. So, we can start by explaining how social liberalism is different to social democracy or democratic socialism, or these left-wing, center-left ideologies that most people are more familiar with. In social democracy, the main narrative is one of negotiated class struggle. So the workplace is the main battlefield. Unionists are the negotiators, and what we're always hoping for is a more favorable truce. So the war never ends, but we can sort of push back the front lines a bit and dig in, and then the knights of organized labor will ride out and, defend the boundaries. But the war will never be over. Where there's no further expectation of moving on to some kind of worker state utopia that's been dashed. It's just a sort of, we all still want to be engaged in capitalism, but we want to be engaged in capitalism on better terms. And the way we're going to do that is by organizing worker power. Um, Social liberalism, on the other hand, focuses on the idea of universal economic rights. So we take the sort of shopping list of liberal rights, free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and we add some minimal economic provisions to that, like freedom from poverty, freedom from homelessness, etc. It's overtly focused on formal political measures, and it aims to fix the workplace by changing conditions around it. Now, another thing we can do, because we're examining an ideology, we can look at their answer to the most important question that an ideology has to answer, and that is, who am I? My Middle East politics professor, Andrew Vincent of Macquarie University, who's a very respected figure, now passed away, he used to say that this is what an ideology is. An ideology is the thing that answers this question, who am I? I am a Christian. I am a worker, for example. So that's the social democracy or Marxist answer is you are a worker. And that means you're a good person because you're, working hard and producing for the community, not like these nasty parasite capitalists who are laying back and they're the, ones who want something for free. Right? Social liberalism has a different narrative. It says you're a citizen. We start with your political nature, not with your economic contribution. Here's another way I like to think about it. You can think of politics in this as a kind of Venn diagram here that I've got. So collectivist, which means concerned with the common good, and we can also talk about the egalitarian impulse, which means concerned with fairness. So fair treatment of the individuals within the group. And then there's the individualist approach, which is primarily concerned with freedom, individual freedom. So we can say that communism might be collectivist, but not egalitarian. So we're not concerned about treating the members of the group fairly. We just want everybody to pull together. And if someone's rights have to be sacrificed for the good of the greater community, so be it. This is obviously, there are going to be communists who argue with that description, but please just suspend disbelief and go with me for a second here. Neoliberalism, on the other hand, might be considered entirely individualist. So it doesn't matter if people are starving in India or whatever. Bill Gates can donate a bit of money if he wants, but really that's up to him. And rich people are celebrated as an expression of individual achievement and personal liberty. So social democracy would be collectivist and egalitarian. Social liberalism be individualist and egalitarian. So our primary, we start with the individual and individual rights, and then we also try and build in fairness. Or we start with fairness and try and build in individual rights. But we're less concerned with the collective, except as an extension of the individuals. So here's a question: what does social democracy get wrong? First of all, it's not global. It, you know, it sort of imagines a bunch of individual nation states, and the goal, I like to say, is a tessellating map of fully employed nation states. That's the goal. And that's a bad narrative. It's class struggle, which is, it excludes a lot of people who are not traditionally working class. Sort of makes this has this if someone's lucky enough to be born wealthy or born, into the petty bourgeoisie, they're your enemy. That's it. There's nothing to be done except to be in this zero-sum game of workers versus capitalists that has been going on for hundreds of years and will continue forever. It's a bad vision, right? Because what they're all social democratic policies basically, like most conservative politics, is based around the vision of a fully employed nation state. That's what success is everybody's waking up and going to work and working full time and producing a lot of goods and getting a good paycheck, and that's what human life is all about, and that's where it kind of ends. An even worse question, an even more upsetting question that you're not supposed to ask on the left is, what does neoliberalism get right? And obviously there's the global thing, but even more important than that is consumption is good. Neoliberalism is pro-consumption. Neoliberalism wants everybody to have a car and a house, or at least says it does. Wants everybody to have a car and a house and consumer goods. Whereas a lot of people on the left seem to, just want people to be good and for everything to be fair, but the idea of prosperity and plenty and comfort is less central. It also sort of leaves out something called the entrepreneurial self, and here I'm thinking of work by a PhD holder from, again, University of Technology, Brisbane, anyhow, definitely in Brisbane, Loriana Lucioni, and she's done work on a basic income and attitudes towards it and sort of the ideation around it. And one of the things she talks about is the idea of the entrepreneurial self, and what she means by that is not that everyone's going to start a startup or have an Etsy brand online. What she means is that the the example she gives is a homesteader who wants to go off and live off the grid. That's a version of the entrepreneurial self. But you could imagine, a poet or a busker or anybody whose vision of themselves is not working in a Fordist employer-employee relationship. The other thing I think neoliberalism gets right is what I call superficial diversity. So it's often a complaint about neoliberalism from the left that, oh, we like multiculturalism and stuff, but only on the surface, because underneath you want everything to be a product, and underneath you want every country to be one part of one big global economy that has the same rules. And I want everything, the whole global economy, to be part of one big system that has the same rules. I just want different rules to what the neoliberals want. I want everyone in the world to have good rights. Like, I don't think that uh, diversity in terms of workers' rights is good. I don't think diversity in terms of child marriage is good. I don't think diversity in terms of the quality of healthcare people get is good. We actually only want diversity on the surface. So you can get married in a church, you can get married in a mosque, you can get married next to a big oak tree on the beach or whatever you like, but you cannot get married to a child, for example. That would be an example of superficial diversity. And neoliberalism is always trying to achieve this through, the World Trade Organization. Neoliberal organizations and neoliberal actors are always trying to achieve this via global standardization and making economic systems around the world interoperable with each other. And I think that's a good thing. We just want that global standard to be one of at a higher standard of worker and environmental rights, right? It's global, obviously. So, whereas neoliberal globalization is arguing for downwards harmonization, global social liberalism wants upwards harmonization. That's the difference. We don't want to race to the bottom, we want to race to the top. Another way of looking at the topic is to just give some examples. Who is a social liberal? Well, FDR was a social liberal. Quite explicitly, he proposed an economic bill of rights, which is a social liberal approach, takes individual people, gives them economic rights. And a global social liberal was his then widow, Eleanor Roosevelt, who authored the Declaration of Human Rights, which includes significant economic content. It includes stuff about, rights to housing and work and things like that. Those specific economic rights aren't necessarily the ones that I would emphasize, but it is the same approach that I would take. I would also suggest Rutger Bregman is part of a kind of millennial renaissance of global social liberalism. And if you've ever traveled, when I was a bit younger, and you go stay at backpacker hostels, and there's a kind of global youth culture. To me, it seems, sort of middle class global youth culture of everybody who knows Seinfeld jokes and everybody who, um, Dave Chappelle and the same pop culture, the same sort of basic worldview. And I think the default is essentially amongst this sort of, the Rutger Bregman's demographic, amongst Rutger Bregman's demographic, of which I consider myself a member, his politics is quite standard and is quite popular. And so you can imagine as this generation ages, we're in a position where these values could very quickly become quite powerful. The boomers aren't going to run everything forever. So the millennial renaissance is earnest and hopeful, and is not afraid to be accused of naive humanism. Right? So his book, Humankind, A Hopeful History, is all about how, humans aren't actually all that terrible, and we often do work together, and we don't need to have such a dark view of human nature as we sometimes do. And that underpins, that sort of humanist positivity underpins global social liberalism. And hopefully, you, person who's watching this. Right? So what? Always the most important question. So I'm just pitching a name. And if I pitch the name, the idea is that if we start to use that name, global social liberalism, global social liberalist, then we can recognize ourselves and we can recognize each other as a first step. And if we agree that these are values that we share, individualism, egalitarianism, and globalism, then we can start to build a program on those values that's distinct from the same old lefty, boring moralistic crap that's just been going on forever. Then we can develop a broader agenda to succeed neoliberalism, not be an alternative, but be a new mainstream, which replaces neoliberalism and isn't like, always the underdog, because that is a way of shirking responsibility, actually. All right, so let's put this in context. The dominant economic ideology since 1945, I think, can be summarized as social democracy from World War II to the 1970s. Then from the 1970s to 2008, neoliberalism. From 2008 till the start of the pandemic, zombie neoliberalism. From 2020 to 2022, we had this kind of pandemic emergency of low rates and high spending, which was a kind of unique phenomenon. And in 2023, we're coming out of that and into whatever comes next. And I do not think we will go back to what we had before. I think it'll be new. I think it'll be different. There's probably going to be some crisis involved. But whatever comes next will draw on all of these traditions. What's most likely is a kind of Trumpist economic nationalism. So it'll draw on the worst of all of these traditions. And that's sort of where we're headed right now. And you see that, social democracy ends up agreeing a lot of the time with someone like Trump about tearing up NAFTA. And I agree about tearing up NAFTA as well. What I want are better global trade agreements put in place, not a return to economic nationalism, because that's fucking crazy and stupid and backwards, right? Having a global economy is a profoundly productive thing. All the you can't make computers for just one country. If you're going to make a high quality computer, you have to be selling to a global market, or you can't justify the investment, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, the most likely outcome is Trump Trumpist economic nationalism, which would be a disaster. But the most desirable is global social liberalism. As Gramsci would say, pessimism of the mind, optimism of the will. And of course, Gramsci was, a communist, and I'm not. And he would say, oh, you're taking my, if say people might say I'm, stealing his ideas. Fine. Yep. I'm taking the bits I like. So long-term goals that we could agree on as global social liberals would be, I think, a world parliament where, because, we're all citizens of the world. We all get a vote, and that world parliament would oversee the reforms of global institutions, including global financial institutions like the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization. And once we've done that, once we have control over those organizations through a democratic body, we can issue a global basic income, which would be, the beginning of civilized life on human earth. When we say we're not going to let people starve because of, conditions outside their control. We're not going to live in a world where we're putting people on Mars and we're also having babies die of diarrhea, and a global basic income can do that. So that's what we should do. And this, I imagine, would be issued in a new global currency tied to IMF SDRs or equivalent, and we would have a new global reserve that's not the US dollar because, America is not the boss of the world, and they need to manage their own currency according to their national interests, and their national interests are going to diverge from what we need from a global currency and a global monetary system. So the era of the dollar has to end at some stage, and when it does, we don't want it displaced by the euro or the yuan or some other national currency. We want a global currency managed globally for a global economy. And now there are three different strategies I would suggest, which are how we might get there. One is called the Alliance of Democracies, and there's versions of this sort of out there. I think the best idea of the version of this is just what I call a trade desirability index. So democracies all prefer to trade with each other, more or less. Right? So there's a strong Darwinian impulse we apply to national economies, and we punish non-democratic economies, and we reward democratic economies, and we favor each other. And we can factor in other things. You can also factor in, oh well, this is a third world country, so they're a poorer country, so they get some other bump up in the index and lower tariffs when they're accessing the developed economies, etc. You can imagine because what we do at the moment is we randomly put sanctions on people for political reasons, rather than having a standardized set of rules which you can follow to get better trade access. And you can know that it's going to be consistent rather than, geopolitically determined. And another strategy is reform of the United Nations. So we use the internal mechanisms detailed in the United Nations procedures, and we trigger them and change the rules. That's one of the strategies that will have to be a part of it. The third strategy, which I like the most, is the global tribunate strategy. Now, I'm taking this idea from George Monbiot, the British writer. He wrote in his 2003 or 2004, early 2000s book called The Age of Consent. He talked about a world parliament, and the example he used was how the tribunes of ancient Rome, the tribunes of the plebs, were sort of established independently of the Senate and then thrust upon it. So rather than, so the Senate in this case is the global institutions, the IMF, World Bank, United Nations, et cetera, and we, the people, he suggested we do this through the World Social Forum in Porto Alegre, for example, that, we, the people, just somehow organize our own parliament, our own bunch of representatives, and they show up and say, hey guys, we've been elected by the people, so you have to listen to us now. And if no one listens, we, start torching cop cars and smashing bank windows and all that, other stuff that people do to force political change. So yeah, the people of the world set up their own parliament or equivalent and impose a process of reform on the global institutions.